Imagine standing in a dusty attic, the air thick and stale, the only light coming from a single cracked window. Your grandmother just passed away. The family is downstairs, quiet, grieving, and someone asks you to go upstairs alone to sort through her things. You climb the stairs slowly. You push open the door, and there, in the corner of the room, half buried under old blankets and forgotten boxes, is a trunk. A big, dark, wooden trunk with a rusted iron latch. You've never seen it before in your life. No one told you it was there. And as you kneel down in front of it, reach out your hand and touch the latch, you hear it. A sound. From inside, something moves. Welcome. You're watching the Fear Sermon. And before we go one single step further into this story, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button, hit subscribe. Because what I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that will stay with you long after you've closed your phone, turned off your screen, and tried to fall asleep tonight. This is a story about a family, a secret, and a trunk that should have stayed locked forever. Stay with me. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to a small town in rural Tennessee in the summer of 2003. A woman named Dorothy Calloway had lived alone in her farmhouse for 31 years. She was 74 years old, sharp-minded, quiet, deeply private. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who grew the best tomatoes on the road, who never missed Sunday church, and who never, not once in 3 decades, invited anyone inside her home. Not the mailman, not the pastor, not even her own children, who had long since moved away to cities across the country and called once a month if they remembered. Dorothy lived alone, and Dorothy kept her secrets. When Dorothy passed away quietly in her sleep one July morning, it fell to her eldest daughter, Sandra, to come back to the farmhouse and handle the estate. Sandra hadn't been home in 11 years. She flew in from Chicago with her husband, Michael, and her teenage son, Danny. They landed in Nashville, rented a car, drove 2 hours south, and pulled up to the farmhouse just as the sun was going down. Sandra sat in the passenger seat for a long moment, just staring at the house. It looked exactly the same as she remembered it. Same white paint peeling at the corners, same wooden porch with a swing that creaked, same rose bushes her mother had planted in 1987. And the same heaviness in the air, that feeling Sandra had always had when she came here as a child. A feeling she could never quite name. They went inside. The house smelled like lavender and old paper, and something else underneath it, something earthy and deep. Sandra walked through the room slowly, touching the walls, running her fingers along the edge of the kitchen counter. Her mother's reading glasses were still sitting on the table next to her Bible. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay open beside them. It looked like Dorothy had simply stepped outside for a moment and would be back any minute. Sandra had to remind herself. She wasn't coming back. That first night they slept in the house, Sandra took her old childhood bedroom. Michael and Danny took the guest room. Nobody slept well. Danny, who was 15 and trying very hard to be cool and unaffected by the whole situation, lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. He could hear the house settling, the old wood beams contracting in the night air. He told himself that's all it was. Wood and temperature and physics. He told himself that several times. The next morning, Sandra began going through her mother's belongings. She started in the kitchen, then the living room, boxing things up, making decisions about what to keep and what to donate. Michael helped her. Danny wandered the house, bored and restless, and that's when Danny found the attic door. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, set into the ceiling with a pull cord hanging down. Danny had walked past it 3 times before he noticed it. He stood in the hallway looking up at it for a moment. He reached up and pulled the cord. A fold-down ladder descended with a long, creaking groan. Danny looked down the hallway. His parents were downstairs. He put his foot on the first rung. The attic was low, ceilinged, and dim. The only light came from a small round window at the far end, caked with years of dust and grime. Danny pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. He swept the beam around the space, old boxes, a broken rocking chair, a coat rack with no coats, dusty picture frames stacked against the wall. The kind of ordinary clutter you'd expect to find in any old house. Danny started to turn back, and then the beam of his flashlight landed on it. In the far corner of the attic, behind a stack of cardboard boxes, there was a trunk. It was large and rectangular, built from dark wood that looked almost black in the flashlight's beam. Iron bands ran around its edges, fastened with heavy bolts that had gone rust orange with age. The latch on the front was a thick iron clasp, the kind you'd need a key for, or a very determined person. Danny stood at the top of the ladder for a moment, just looking at it. There was no logical reason for what he felt in that moment. He was 15 years old. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in video games and basketball, and trying to impress girls at school. But standing at the top of that ladder, looking at that trunk in the corner of his dead great-grandmother's attic, Danny felt something he would spend years trying to describe accurately. He felt like the trunk was looking back. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He crossed the attic floor carefully, stepping over boxes. He crouched down in front of the trunk. Up close, it was even more striking. The wood was incredibly old, clearly, but it had been made with extraordinary care. There were faint carvings along the sides, geometric patterns that had almost been worn smooth by time. Danny reached out and ran his fingers over them. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been, he thought, on a July morning in Tennessee. He put his hand on the latch, and something moved inside. Danny yanked his hand back so fast he nearly fell over. He scrambled backward, knocking into the cardboard boxes. He stood up. His heart was hammering. He stared at the trunk. It was perfectly still, perfectly silent. The attic was quiet except for the sound of his own breathing and the distant sound of his parents talking downstairs. He waited. Nothing. He stood there for a full 2 minutes, not moving, watching the trunk. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. He began to talk himself down. An animal, he told himself. A squirrel, maybe. Raccoons got into old attics all the time. That's all it was. A raccoon or a squirrel inside the trunk, and he'd startled it. Simple, logical, fine. He went back downstairs and said nothing to his parents, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. All through lunch, all through the afternoon of helping pack boxes, all through dinner at the small diner in town. He kept seeing the trunk in his mind. He kept feeling that cold wood under his fingertips, and he kept hearing that sound. That shifting, sliding, unmistakably deliberate sound of something moving. That night, Danny told his father. He tried to be casual about it. He mentioned the trunk in the attic and said he thought maybe there was an animal trapped inside. Michael took it seriously. He went up to the attic with a proper flashlight and came back 10 minutes later with a strange look on his face. "There's a trunk up there, all right," he told Sandra. "Old one, locked. I'll deal with it tomorrow." "Did you hear anything?" Danny asked. Michael was quiet for just a moment. "No," he said, "nothing." But Danny noticed that his father didn't meet his eyes when he said it. The next morning, Michael went up to the attic with a crowbar. Sandra came too, curious now. Danny followed. All three of them stood in that low-ceilinged space in the growing morning heat, looking at the trunk. Sandra was visibly unsettled by it, though she would later say she didn't know why. She'd never seen it before. She had no memory of it from her childhood, and she'd grown up in this house. She knew every corner of it. Or she'd thought she had. "Maybe we should just leave it," Sandra said. "Call someone, an estate professional, or..." "It's fine," Michael said. He was already positioning the crowbar against the latch. "It's probably just old photo albums or something, documents." The latch resisted. Michael had to work at it for several minutes, the crowbar screeching against the old iron. Sandra flinched at the sound. Danny stood back, hands shoved in his pockets, watching. Finally, with a sharp crack that made all three of them jump, the latch gave way. The lid of the trunk shifted slightly upward as if something inside had been pushing against it. Michael straightened up. He looked at Sandra. She looked at him. Danny looked at both of them and said quietly, "Maybe let's just think about this for a second." Nobody listened to Danny. Michael reached down and opened the trunk. What happened next depends on who you ask. Michael will tell you it was nothing. Just an old trunk full of papers and junk, and they all got themselves worked up over nothing. Sandra will tell you something different. Sandra will tell you that when Michael opened that lid, there was a smell that came out of that trunk that she has never been able to describe adequately to anyone. Not decay, not mold, not any of the things you'd expect. Something stranger than that. Something that made her take 2 involuntary steps backward. And Danny will tell you what he saw. He saw the papers first. Old papers, letters, what looked like journals, rubber, banded together in bundles. Photographs, a small wooden box inside the larger trunk. And beneath all of it, lining the bottom of the trunk, what appeared to be some kind of dark fabric. Dark, heavy fabric that lay in the trunk in a heap. And as the 3 of them looked down into the open trunk in that dusty Tennessee attic in the summer heat, Danny watched the fabric move. Not the way fabric moves when you disturb the air around it. Not a settling, not a shift from the vibration of the trunk being opened. It moved the way something moves when it is alive. One slow, deliberate, unmistakable movement. Danny pointed. "Did you see that?" Michael slammed the lid shut. None of them spoke for about 30 seconds. "What was that?" Sandra said. Her voice was very flat. "I don't know," Michael said. "Michael, I don't know, Sandra. An animal. It has to be an animal. Nothing could live in there," Sandra said. "It was sealed. The latch was rusted, not airtight. Something could have gotten in through a gap in the wood. Mice, snakes, something. Nobody wanted to open the trunk again that day." They went downstairs. Michael called a local pest control service. The man who came was a heavy-set, cheerful person named Roy, who had clearly heard every kind of animal. In the attic story there was, and was not going to be rattled by any of them. He went upstairs. He was up there for about 15 minutes. When he came back downstairs, he wasn't cheerful anymore. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the family for a moment before he spoke. "I opened the trunk," he said. "And," Michael said, "there's no animal in there." Silence. "There's papers and stuff," Roy said. "And look, I don't know what you folks have got going on up there, but there's nothing alive in that trunk. I checked thoroughly, and there's no way anything could have gotten in there anyway. Those boards, the sideboards, they're solid. I mean really solid. Old-growth timber jointed tight. Whatever that trunk is, it was built to keep things in or out. I can't tell you which." He left shortly after that, declining to elaborate and clearly not wanting to discuss it further. The family sat in the kitchen. The afternoon light was coming through the windows. Sandra had made coffee without really thinking about it. They sat around the table and nobody said anything for a long time. "We need to look at those papers," Sandra finally said. "Sandra, they're my mother's things, Michael. Whatever is up there, whatever is in that trunk, it belonged to my mother, and she never showed it to me. She never told me it existed. I need to know what's in it." They went up together, all 3 of them. Danny felt that he absolutely did not want to go, but that he absolutely could not stay downstairs alone either, so he went. Michael opened the trunk again, slowly this time, standing back. No smell this time, Sandra would later note. Or maybe they were prepared for it. The fabric lay still at the bottom. It was, on closer inspection, a heavy black cloth, almost like a velvet, folded into layers. Nobody touched it. Michael lifted out the bundles of papers carefully, handing them down to Sandra. There were 7 bundles in total, tied with what had once been red ribbon, now faded to a dusty pink. The photographs were loose, tucked between the bundles. The small wooden box came last. It was about the size of a shoebox, made from the same dark wood as the trunk, with a small brass latch that opened easily. Inside the box were 3 things: a letter, a key, and a photograph that made Sandra sit down on the attic floor and put her hand over her mouth. The photograph was old, sepia-toned, the kind taken sometime in the early 20th century. It showed 2 women standing in front of what appeared to be a house. They were dressed in the style of the era, long skirts, high collars. They were standing very close together, and both of them were looking directly at the camera. One of the women was clearly older, perhaps 60, with white hair pinned severely back. The other woman was younger, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a solemn expression. Sandra stared at this photograph for a long time, then she showed it to Michael, then Danny. "Who are they?" Danny asked. "I don't know the older woman," Sandra said very quietly, "but the younger one." She paused. "I think that's my grandmother, my mother's mother, Eliza." "Your great-grandmother," Michael said. "She died before I was born. My mother never talked about her, ever, not once, as long as I can remember. Any time I asked, she would change the subject." Sandra looked down at the photograph again. "I always thought it was just grief, that it hurt too much to talk about her, but now," she didn't finish the sentence. "They brought everything downstairs. They spread it out on the kitchen table, and slowly, over the course of that afternoon and evening, Sandra began to read. The letters were old. The oldest ones were dated 1931, written in a formal, careful cursive that Sandra had to lean close to decipher. They were addressed to someone named Eliza, last name Harrow. Eliza Harrow, not Calloway, not Sandra's family name. Harrow, a name that meant nothing to Sandra, a name she had never heard in her life. The letter writer was identified only as M. The tone of the letters was strange, fluctuating between warm and almost academic, filled with references Sandra couldn't place. References to something called the practice, to what M called the old work, to preparations that needed to be made, to a night that was coming, to something M described only as the arrangement, always in italics, always with a reverence in the language that made the hair on Sandra's arms rise. Sandra read the letters slowly, rereading sections, trying to piece together what she was understanding. Michael sat across from her, reading over her shoulder. Danny sat at the other end of the table, looking at the photographs. By the time the sun went down, they had a partial picture. A fragmentary, incomplete, deeply unsettling partial picture. Eliza Harrow had been, based on the letters, a woman who belonged to some kind of group, not a church. Not any kind of organization Sandra could clearly identify. The letters referenced rituals, they referenced objects that needed to be kept in specific ways. One letter, dated 1934, referred explicitly to a trunk, to what M called the containing vessel. There was a detailed, almost technical description of how the trunk should be maintained. What should be placed inside it, what should never be removed, and at the end of that letter, a single sentence that Sandra read 3 times before she let herself fully take it in. The arrangement made with the vessel must be honored by each generation that follows, or what was sealed will be released. Sandra set the letter down. "What does that mean?" Danny said. He'd been reading over his mother's shoulder for the last 20 minutes. "I don't know," Sandra said. "What was sealed?" Danny said. "Danny," Michael said, a warning in his voice. "No, seriously, what was sealed? Because I watched something move in that trunk. We all saw it. Something moved in that sealed trunk, and now we're reading about something that was sealed, and I think we should talk about what that might, Danny." Michael's voice was firm. "We're not going to get frightened by old letters. There's an explanation for everything we've seen and heard in this house. There is always an explanation." Danny looked at his father for a moment. "You heard it too," he said, "in the attic, the first time you went up. You heard something in the trunk. I saw your face." Michael was quiet. "Didn't you?" Danny said. "I heard something." Michael said finally, "I don't know what it was." They found the journals next. They were in the second bundle, 4 small notebooks with worn covers, filled from front to back in 2 different handwritings. One was Eliza's, identified by name on the first page of the first notebook. The other handwriting appeared in the margins and on occasional separate pages, and was never identified. It was different from the letter writer M, smaller, more cramped, written in ink that had gone rust, brown with age. Sandra read the journals through most of the night. Michael fell asleep in the armchair sometime around 2 in the morning. Danny stayed awake, sitting at the table, not wanting to be alone anywhere in this house. He didn't read the journals himself. He watched his mother's face as she read them, and what he saw on his mother's face was what stayed with him longest. Sandra was not, by nature, an expressive person. She was practical, composed, the kind of woman who handled crises by making lists and taking action. Danny had watched her deal with difficult things over the years, and had rarely seen her lose that composure. But as she read those journals, her face changed. It cycled through expressions Danny couldn't fully catalog. Confusion, recognition, something that might have been grief, and more than once, something that was unambiguously fear. At 3 in the morning, Sandra closed the last journal. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house, her hands flat on the notebook cover, and stared at nothing for a while. Danny waited. "Mom," he finally said, "what's in there?" Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your great-grandmother made a deal." Danny waited. "A long time ago," Sandra said. "When she was very young, before she had children. She was involved with people who believed in things that are very difficult to talk about in the plain light of day. Things that most people would say don't exist. She believed in them, they all believed in them, and she made an arrangement." Sandra paused. She seemed to be choosing her words with great care. She believed that she had brought something into her life, something that helped her, something that she felt had given her things, and in exchange that something needed to be housed, contained, kept in a specific way and in a specific place. And the journals say— Sandra stopped. "What?" Danny said. "The journals say that every generation has to maintain the containing vessel, has to keep it, has to honor the arrangement, or—" She stopped again. "Or what, Mom?" Sandra looked at her son. "Or it gets loose," she said. The house was very quiet. They didn't sleep after that. In the morning, Sandra called her brother, Thomas, who lived in Atlanta. She tried to explain what they'd found. Thomas was skeptical and dismissive in the way that Sandra had expected him to be, right up until she read him the specific passage from the 1934 letter. Thomas was quiet for a while after that. He said he'd come. He drove up that afternoon. Thomas was 51, an engineer, a man who had built his entire identity around pragmatism and reason. He walked into the farmhouse with the energy of someone who was going to sort all of this out in about an hour. He read the letters, he read the relevant sections of the journals. He went up to the attic and looked at the trunk. He came back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a while. "There's a rational explanation," he said. "Thomas," Sandra said. "There's always a rational explanation. What we're dealing with here is an old woman who was involved with some kind of folk magic community. That was not uncommon in rural areas in the early 20th century. What she believed about what was in that trunk doesn't mean there's actually anything in the trunk. It means she believed there's a difference. Something moved in that trunk," Sandra said. "Michael heard it. Danny saw it. Animals," Thomas said. "Suggestion, people see what they expect to see in situations like this. You went up there expecting something strange, and you found something strange. That's how minds work. Thomas, I need you to tell me what we should do with it." Thomas looked at his sister. He looked at Michael, who was watching him from across the table. He looked at Danny. He took a breath. "We're going to take the trunk out of the attic and dispose of it properly. We're going to clear this house and get it ready to sell, and we're going to go home. That's what we're going to do." "The journals say it can't be removed," Sandra said. "Sandra, they say if the vessel is removed from the property." "Sandra, I am an engineer. I am a rational human being. I am not going to be told what to do by the instructions in an old notebook written by someone who believed in folk magic." Thomas went upstairs. He was gone for 45 minutes. When he came back downstairs, he was a different color. He sat down at the kitchen table without speaking. Sandra watched him. Michael watched him. Danny watched him. "Thomas," Sandra said. "I'm fine." Thomas said. "What happened up there?" Thomas looked at his hands on the table. He looked at them for a long time. "I tried to move the trunk," he said, "and I couldn't lift it. I couldn't even get it off the floor. I'm not a small person, Sandra. I'm not weak. I put everything I had into it, and it didn't move. It didn't move at all. Like it was bolted to the floor, like it weighed." He shook his head, and then what? Sandra said. Thomas looked up at her. Something knocked on the lid, he said, from the inside 3 times, slow, deliberate. He paused. I left. Nobody spoke. I left very quickly, Thomas said, and I'm not going back up there. Now, this is the point in this story where I want to pause for just a moment, because this is where a lot of people expect the story to end. They expect the family to call someone, a priest, maybe, or a paranormal investigator. They expect some kind of dramatic confrontation, some kind of resolution. But that's not what happened, because this isn't a horror movie. This is a real family dealing with something that falls entirely outside the framework of anything they had been raised to believe in. And when something falls outside your framework, the response isn't usually dramatic. The response is usually a long, confusing silence followed by everyone deciding to handle it practically and hope for the best. They decided not to move the trunk. They decided not to open it again. Thomas made some calls and located a historian and archivist who specialized in regional folk traditions and who came out 3 days later, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Ashe. Dr. Ashe spent an entire day in the farmhouse. She examined the trunk. She read the letters and journals. She photographed everything carefully. She interviewed Sandra and Thomas and Michael and even Danny, who was the only one who had actually touched the trunk. Dr. Ashe was not dismissive. She was not a sensationalist either. She was, in the way of very good academics, extremely precise and careful. She told them that what they were dealing with appeared to be a specific practice tradition that had been documented in isolated pockets of rural America in the late 19th and early 20th century. She didn't call it folk magic. She called it contractual spiritualism, which somehow sounded both more academic and more ominous. She said that the trunk itself was significant, that trunks and chests as containing vessels appeared in multiple traditions as objects used to house what practitioners called bound entities, presences that had been made subject to specific conditions of containment in exchange for some benefit to the person who bound them. And the moving, Michael said, the sounds, we all heard sounds. Dr. Ashe looked at him very calmly. What do you want me to tell you? She said. I can tell you what the tradition says. The tradition says that something bound in a containing vessel will make its presence known when the vessel is threatened or when the conditions of arrangement are not being honored. The tradition says this is a form of communication, not aggression. She paused. I can't tell you whether I believe that tradition is describing something real. What I can tell you is that the tradition is internally consistent and very specific and has been documented independently in multiple communities that had no contact with each other. What do we do? Sandra said. The tradition is clear about that, Dr. Ashe said. You honor the arrangement, you maintain the vessel, you keep it in the house in a designated space, and you do what the journals describe, what your great-grandmother's journals describe as maintenance. She looked at Sandra. It's very specific. It's not difficult. It involves specific things done at specific times, and according to every account I've ever read of this tradition, as long as the maintenance is honored, there is no danger to anyone. And if we don't, Danny said. Dr. Ashe looked at him for a moment. Then the arrangement ends, she said. And what was sealed is no longer sealed. She paused. The traditions are not consistent on what that means exactly. Some describe a simple dispersal, the bound presence simply leaves. Others describe something more significant. She gathered her notes. I would recommend honoring the arrangement. She left them with a photocopy of her own research notes, a list of references, and her phone number. She said to call if anything changed. The family stayed in the farmhouse for 2 more weeks. Sandra and Thomas made the decision together. They would not sell the house, not yet. They needed to understand what they had inherited before they could decide what to do with it. Thomas, who had arrived so certain and left so shaken, was unexpectedly the one who became most invested in understanding. He requested access to the journals. He began researching the practice independently. He found, in his research, 3 other documented cases in the American South of containing vessels maintained through generations of a single family. 3 cases of trunks, chests, sealed boxes that families had kept for decades quietly without explaining why to outsiders, without attracting attention. Just maintaining, just honoring the arrangement, just keeping the lid closed and doing the specific things at the specific times and living their lives. And Sandra, who had walked into this house grieving a mother she had never fully understood, who had spent years wondering why Dorothy Calloway was so private, so sealed off, so reluctant to let anyone get close. Sandra read through her mother's things more carefully now. She found, tucked inside a Bible in the bedroom, a single sheet of paper in her mother's handwriting. A list, specific dates, specific instructions, small things, ordinary, seeming things, things you would never look at twice if you didn't know what they were for. A list of things Dorothy had done every year for 31 years alone in that house, maintaining, honoring, never telling anyone, never explaining, just carrying it alone the way she had carried everything in her life. Quietly, without complaint, Sandra sat on her mother's bed and held that list for a long time. And she understood, for the first time, something about her mother that she had never understood before. Dorothy wasn't sealed off because she didn't love her family. She was sealed off because she was protecting them. She was the keeper. She had been the keeper her whole life. And she had never asked for help because she had never thought she needed to, or maybe because she hadn't known how to explain it, or maybe because she had hoped, in the way that tired people hope, that if she just kept going long enough, the problem would eventually sort itself out. It didn't sort itself out. It passed on the way these things do. Sandra became the keeper. She stayed in the farmhouse for 3 months that summer. Michael went back to Chicago after the first 2 weeks. He and Sandra had long phone calls every night. He was supportive, he was trying, but he was also struggling with the cognitive dissonance of everything he'd experienced in that house and everything he fundamentally believed about how the world worked. Danny stayed. He couldn't have explained why exactly. Something about the trunk, about the story, about his great-grandmother Eliza Harrow and the decision she had made in her young life had taken hold of him in a way he couldn't shake. He helped his mother. He read the journals. He learned the maintenance. Here is the thing about the maintenance. This is the part that most people want to skip over because it doesn't fit the narrative they expect. The maintenance was not dramatic. It was not arcane or frightening or strange. It was, if anything, deeply ordinary. Specific things done on specific days, small gestures, small acts of acknowledgement. The kind of thing that, if you didn't know what it was for, you might mistake for the habits of a slightly eccentric person. Which, Sandra reflected, was probably exactly how her mother had appeared to the neighbors all those years. A slightly eccentric woman who lived alone and had certain particular habits. Nothing more threatening than that. The trunk stayed quiet. After Sandra began the maintenance, after she started doing what the journals instructed, the sounds stopped. The cold stopped. Danny, who had gone up to the attic twice more in those months, reported that the trunk felt like a normal trunk now. Still too heavy to lift, still locked, but normal, unremarkable, just an old piece of furniture in a corner of an attic. Whether that means something or nothing, Sandra would tell you, depends entirely on what you believe. The house was never sold. Sandra eventually moved into it. That surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. But she had come to understand something in those months in Tennessee that she couldn't undo. She had come to understand that some inheritances are not about money or property or objects. Some inheritances are about responsibility, about a thing that was decided before you were born that you are now charged with continuing. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't chosen it, but it was hers. Thomas still comes to visit. He is still an engineer. He is still a rational man, but he now has, Sandra says, a very specific relationship with not having all the answers. He has learned to sit with uncertainty in a way he never could before. She thinks it's made him a better person. Danny is 26 now. He has a degree in folklore and cultural anthropology. He is currently writing his graduate thesis on the documented tradition of contractual spiritualism in the American South. He spends time in the farmhouse regularly. He knows the maintenance better than his mother does now, in some ways. He has asked her more than once what she actually believes about what is in the trunk, whether she thinks it's real, whether she thinks there is actually something in there, something that moves, something that knocks, something that has been bound in that dark wood for nearly a century. Sandra always gives him the same answer. She says, "I think the more important question is not what I believe. The more important question is what my great-great-grandmother believed and what she was willing to do and what she agreed to and what she left behind. Whether or not something is real in the way that we usually mean real. Some things are real in the sense that they have weight. They have consequence. They pass from person to person and generation to generation, and they demand something of the people who carry them. And that is real enough. That is real enough for me to stay here. That is real enough for me to maintain the arrangement. That is real enough to take seriously. The trunk is still in the attic, in the corner, behind the boxes. The farmhouse is still standing in its town in rural Tennessee. The rose bushes Dorothy planted in 1987 are still blooming every spring. And whoever is the keeper of that house is still doing quietly, at specific times on specific days, the small and ordinary and ancient things that the journals describe. Maintaining the vessel, honoring the arrangement, keeping the lid closed. Some nights, very rarely, there is a sound. Not threatening, not violent, just a presence making itself known. A slow, deliberate, unmistakable reminder that it is still there. That it is still waiting, that the deal is still in effect, that the thing that was sealed is still sealed. And every time the keeper acknowledges it, does what the journals say, and the house goes quiet, and the trunk sits in its corner in the dark, and the lid stays closed. This is a story that Stoic Code is proud to have brought to you today, because this is the kind of story that asks something of the person who hears it. Not to believe in anything specific, not to accept any particular framework or world, view or explanation. Just to sit with the uncertainty, just to consider the possibility that the world is stranger and wider and older than we usually allow ourselves to think. Just to remember that every old house has its history, every family has its silences, and some of those silences are being kept for a reason. Before we close today, I want to hear from you. I genuinely want to know, what do you think was in that trunk? Do you think the sounds, the weight, the cold, all of it, do you think there was something real there? Or do you think it was the power of belief, the weight of inherited tradition, the human mind's extraordinary ability to make meaning from mystery? Leave your answer in the comments below. Tell me your theory. Tell me if you've ever experienced something in a family home that you couldn't explain. Tell me if you've ever inherited something that you didn't ask for and didn't fully understand. The comment section is yours. This community, the Stoic Code community, is built on exactly these conversations. The ones that happen late at night when you're willing to think about the things that don't have easy answers. And if this story stayed with you, if it got under your skin the way I hope it did, please share it. Share it with the person in your life who loves a good mystery. Share it with the friend who insists there's an explanation for everything. Share it with the person who grew up in an old house and knows, in their bones, that some rooms feel different from others. Because these stories deserve to be heard, and this channel exists because people like you keep sharing it. I'll be here, the trunk will be in the corner, and whatever is inside it will be exactly where it has always been. Until next time, stay curious, stay open. And if you're ever alone in an old house, exploring a dusty attic, and you come across something in the corner that you've never seen before, and you reach out your hand, and you feel it before you hear it, that cold that shouldn't be there, that feeling of something noticing you back, just remember what you heard today. Remember the journals, remember the arrangement, and maybe, just maybe, leave it closed.